love we spread.
Holy God, we do give you praise and thanks and ask your blessing on our offerings this day. May they be used for building up the world that you imagine, that you call into being, that you invite us to create with you. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
Please be seated.
Our reading is from the book of Acts, chapter 9, verses 1 through 20. Meanwhile, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found anybody who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He asked, "Who are you, Lord?" And the reply came, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard the voice, but saw no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. For 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Please join me in a time of prayer. Holy One, open our hearts and our minds to these old words that they might fall afresh for us. May they bring us comfort where comfort is what we need. May they agitate us where that is what you would have. And may our words and meditations be pleasing and powerful, for we ask it in Christ's name. Amen. Way back when I was in seminary, I used to worry from time to time that there wouldn't be enough to talk about if I ever found myself preaching on almost every Sunday. Just take a look around. Democracy under threat at home and abroad, the rise of right-wing nationalism at home and abroad, high crimes and misdemeanors in the news, a frightening rise in religious violence, climate chaos, the untimely death of a young Christian writer whose words touched so many hearts. The list goes on and on and on and on and on, with items both broadly global and intimately personal. And into the middle of that, we get this ancient story of transformation on the road to Damascus. Couldn't we all use a little bit of transformation these days? The question is always, transformation from what and into what? So what do we know about Saul? The one who is about to get a new name in the story from Acts that Travis just read. We know that he is from Tarsus. That information comes a few verses beyond what we just read, but we have heard it many, many times. We learn along the way that he is a citizen of the Roman Empire, a significant designation. We know that he has connections, such that he can go to the high priest and get authorization for rounding up Jesus' followers in the earliest days of the fledgling Jesus movement. And we know that he is both okay with violence and blind to its effects. And that is like a whole lot of us, down through the years to our very time. I did a great deal of my undergraduate work a long time ago in the Center for Peaceful Change at Kent State University. The center was one of the first undergraduate peace studies programs in the United States, and it began as a living memorial to the 4 students who were shot down there by National Guardsmen during an on-campus protest of President Nixon's decision to expand the Vietnam War into Cambodia in the spring of 1970. Those 4 students and 9 others who were wounded were shot down in the middle of a beautiful spring Monday, in the middle of a bucolic college campus, 49 years ago yesterday. More than a few times in my years at KSU, I stood in the spot in the parking lot where a 20-year-old Jeffrey Miller was gunned down. To say that I identified with a shaggy-haired young man in the middle of an anti-war protest would be accurate. It would also be accurate to say that I began taking classes in the Center for Peaceful Change because I abhor state violence. And the shootings at Kent were nothing if not state violence in response to protest against state violence. For most of human history, state-sanctioned violence has gone hand in hand with religious-sanctioned violence. And most of the time, the state, even where it is officially separate from religion, seeks the sanction of religious leaders for its violence. Both Presidents Johnson and Nixon sought endorsement from American religious leaders during the war in Vietnam, and some religious leaders obliged both of them. As one historian notes of the time, the National Association of Evangelicals met in April of 1966 and passed a law and order resolution that condemned an un-American mood which has invaded our society as godless, revolutionary, and disloyal to government. The resolution pledged evangelical Christians to obedience to the injunctions of Scripture to respect the authorities over us. In the early months of Nixon's presidency, Billy Graham sent the president a 13-page letter offering strategic advice on the waging of the war. That advice included such tactics as recommending bombing the dikes in the north, a tactic that would have resulted in hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths and would also likely have been considered a war crime. The American story hasn't changed that much in the past half-century, and it is not difficult to find religious blessing for our militarized foreign policy all along the way at every single step. In the story from Acts, we see a kind of first-century Palestinian variation on that pattern. Paul, acting with all of the privilege that comes with being a citizen of Rome, seeks the sanction of the high priests for the violent suppression of the nonviolent Jesus movement. State violence is always easy enough to justify from the perspective of the dominant culture in any given society at any given moment. Religious violence is also easy enough to justify from the perspective of the faithful. When those two paths of violence entwine, you get German forces marching off to war for Hitler with the phrase "Gott mit uns," God with us, engraved on their belt buckles. How do we square that with the Jesus who said to Peter, "Put away your sword"? The Jesus who invited his followers who moved from the scriptural teaching, an eye for an eye, to a new teaching, love your enemies. Early in my studies at the Center for Peaceful Change, I began to get to know Martin Luther King as a theologian and social critic, in addition to an orator and movement leader. My own pilgrimage to nonviolence was guided by King's. In his essay by that name, His Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, King wrote in the early 1960s, reflecting back on the Montgomery bus boycott from the mid-1950s. As the days unfolded, I became more and more convinced of the power of nonviolence. Nonviolence became more than a method to which I gave intellectual assent. It became a commitment to a way of life. Similarly, for me, over time, nonviolence became much more than a tactic. Nonviolence is, for me, what a Mennonite friend calls a more perfect expression of Christian life and faith. Like the phrase, a more perfect union, the idea captured in a more perfect expression of Christian faith is aspirational and unrealizable. After all, as Nietzsche almost said, the only fully realized Christian died on the cross. You can go look up the exact words. It's not quite that, but it's pretty close. What would it mean to claim nonviolence not merely as a tactic or even as an aspiration, but instead as a central tenet, an organizing principle of Christian life? Moreover, for this moment, why bring up any of this on a Sunday when we commission a new staff member and in so doing affirm a bold new commitment for mission? Well, for one thing, our world is, if anything, more awash in violence than was Dr. King's. Violence done in the name of religious conviction has struck houses of worship in the three Abrahamic traditions in the past 6 weeks alone, and resulted in the deaths of scores of Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Folks who were simply engaged in the act of worshiping God. In other words, fanatics acting in the name of God. In 2019, in the United States, New Zealand, Sri Lanka, among other places, have done basically exactly what Paul was doing to the followers of Jesus as the book of Acts begins in first century Palestine. It took losing his sight for Paul's eyes to be opened. It took being blinded on the road to Damascus for Paul to see that one eye traded for another is a dead-end street. It took being cast into darkness for Paul to perceive the light of love. And that, after all, is the real point in all of this. As the first letter from John puts it so clearly and succinctly, God is love. God is love. As Jesus put it also clearly and succinctly, love one another. As he similarly summarized the entirety of the law and the prophets, the whole of Jewish life and faith, clearly and succinctly. Love God, love the neighbor. That's it. All the rest is footnotes. The Christian response to violence is simply and succinctly love. Love. Now that's obviously both incredibly simple to say and incredibly difficult and complicated to do. But for us in this moment, as we begin to live together into a new thing that God is doing in our midst, I believe that love looks a lot like the parable of the nations at the end of chapter 25 in the Gospel of Matthew. And you know it by the shorthand. Whatever you did to the least of these, my siblings, you did it to me. Whatever you did to the least of these, you did to Jesus. When a year ago we began the self-study that brought us to where we are today, what the discernment group noted over and over again was a deeply felt desire of this congregation to be more compassionately connected with the marginalized members of the broader community. People wind up on the margins because of violence. people lined up on the margins because of violence. Economic violence, the violence of racism and homophobia, the violence of sexism, all kinds of other manifestations of violence that act to protect the privileged and push to the margins all of those who can be thought of as other. And I've got news for you. All of us, in so many ways, are so privileged, but each of us can be othered. Each of us can be othered. And when we are violently pushed to the margins. You can interpret that through various lenses. Progressive values, liberal activism, and so on. I look at it first through the theological lenses, and particularly the lens of Matthew 25. When I look through that lens, I see a people who want to know Jesus more deeply and who understand that the way to get there is by way of the margins. But the best lenses in the world will not help you see more clearly if you have no sight to begin with. If my eyes have been blinded by violence, then I might not see the poor one. If my eyes have been blinded by violence, I might not see the immigrant. If my eyes have been blinded by violence, I might not see my LGBTQIA friend. I might not see the hungry family. I might not see the asylum seeker standing right in front of me if my eyes have been blinded by violence. On the road to Damascus, Saul came to see that he could not see. And he came to know what he was missing. Opportunities to get to know Jesus in the person of the oppressed. I'm going to stop here for now, even though there is so much more that needs to be said by way of theology and praxis regarding nonviolence. For now, having begun with a memory of May 4th, I'll end with the theology of Star Wars. You know, may the 4th be with you.
I was waiting.
But seriously, Yoda's deep insight that fear is the path to the dark side is incredibly important. Because when we act out of fear, we turn. We turn away from the marginalized, almost like we are afraid that their condition might be contagious. And in our fear, we also turn all too quickly to violence. And when that happens, we are blinded to Jesus standing right in front of us. It does not have to happen that way. Along the road to what's next, if we are ever to be blinded, may it be by the bright light of love shining incandescently in our midst. And may we grow to reflect that light in all that we say and do.